Alrighty. Chapter 8. The Potions Master. Alright. There. Look. Where? Next to that tall kid with the red hair. Wearing the glasses? Did you see his face? Did you see his scar? Whispers followed Harry from the moment he left. In the dormitory, the next day, people lining up outside the classroom stood tiptoe to get a good look at him. Doubled back and passed him in on the corridors. Again, staring. Harry wished they wouldn't, because he was trying to concentrate on finding his way to classes. There were 142 staircases at Hogwarts wide. Sweeping ones, narrow, trickety ones. And that led to somewhere different on Friday, somewhere vanishing step halfway up they had to remember to jump. Then there were doors that wouldn't open unless you asked politely or tickled them in exactly the right place. The doors weren't really doors at all, but they were solid walls just pretending. It was all very hard to remember where anything was, because it seemed all the more to move around a lot. And people in their portraits kept going and visiting each other, and Harry wasn't the coat of arms could talk. The ghost didn't help either, because it was always a nasty shock when one of them glided suddenly through the door when you were trying to open. Nearly Headless Nick was always happy to point new Gryffindors in the right direction, but Peeves, the poltergeist, was worth two locked doors and a trick staircase. If you met him when you were late for class, you would drop wastepaper baskets on your head. He would pull rugs out from under your feet, pelt you with bits of chalk, or sneak up on you invisible and grab your nose and tweak you. Got your conk! Even worse than Peeves, if that was possible, was the caretaker, Argus Filch. Harry and Ron managed to get on the wrong side of him. On their way in the very first morning, Filch found them trying to force their way through a door that unluckily turned out to be the entrance to the out-of-bounds corridor on the third floor. He wouldn't believe us that we were lost, was sure that we were trying to break into it on purpose, and was threatening to lock them in the dungeons when they were rescued by Professor Quirrell, who was passing. Filch owned a cat called Mrs. Norris, a scrawny, dust-colored creature with bulging, lamp-like eyes, just like Filch's. She patrolled the corridors alone. Break a rule in front of her, put just one toe out of line, and she'd whisk off for Filch, who'd appear, wheezing 2 seconds later. Filch knew the secret passages of the school better than anyone, except perhaps the Weasley twins, who could pop up suddenly as any of the ghosts. The students all hated him, and it was the dearest ambition of many to give Mrs. Norris a good kick. And then, once you had managed to find them, there were the classes themselves. There was a lot more to magic, as Harry quickly found out, than waving your wand and saying a few funny words. They had to study the night skies through their telescopes every Wednesday at midnight. They had to learn the names of different stars and the movement of the planets. 3 times a week they went out to the greenhouse behind the castle to study herbology with the dumpy little witch called Professor Sprout, where they learned how to take care of all strange plants and fungi and found out what they were used for. Easily the most boring class at Hogwarts was the history of magic, which was the only one taught by a ghost. Professor Binns had been very old indeed when he had fallen asleep in front of the staff room on fire. Got up the next morning to teach, leaving his body behind him. Binns droned on and on while they scribbled down names and dates of Emmerich the Evil, Eric the Oddball mixed up. Professor Flitwick was the charms teacher. He was a tiny little wizard who had to stand on a pile of books to see over the desks. At the start of class, the first class he took, the roll call, when he reached Harry's name, he gave an excited squeak and toppled out of sight. Professor McGonagall was again all different. Harry had been quite right to think she wasn't a teacher to cross. Strict and clever, she gave them a talking to the moment they sat down in front of class. Transfiguration is something more complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she said. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. Then she changed her desk into a pig and back again. They were all very impressed and couldn't wait to get started, but soon realized they weren't going to be changing furniture into animals. For a long time, after taking a lot of complicated notes, they were each given a match. They started trying to turn it into a needle. By the end of the lesson, only Hermione Granger herself made any difference in her match. Professor McGonagall showed the class how to be done all silver and pointy, and gave Hermione a rare smile. The class everyone had really been looking for was the defense of dark arts, but Quirrell's lessons turned out to be a bit of a joke. His class smelled strongly of garlic, which everyone was to ward off the vampire he met at Romania, and he was afraid he would come back again to get him one of these days. His turban, he told them, had been given to him by an African prince as a thank you for getting rid of a troublesome zombie. But they weren't sure they believed this story. For one thing, Seamus Finnegan asked eagerly to hear how Quirrell had fought off a zombie. Quirrell went pink and started talking about the weather. For another, they had noticed that funny smell hanging around the turban, and Weasley twins insisted that it was a stuff full of garlic as well, so that Quirrell was protected wherever he went. Harry was relieved to find that he was not the only miles behind everyone else. Lots of people had come from Muggle families, and like him, they hadn't any idea what they witches and wizards were. There was so much to learn. Even people like Ron didn't have much of a head to start. Friday was an important day for Harry and Ron. They finally managed to find their way down to the Great Hall for breakfast without getting lost once. We've got, we've, we have got, we, what have we got today? Harry asked Ron and poured sugar on his porridge. Double potions with Slytherins, said Ron. Snape's head of Slytherin. They say he's always favored them. We'll be able to see if that's true. Wish McGonagall favored us, said Harry. Professor McGonagall was the head of the House of Gryffindor, but it hadn't stopped her from giving them a huge pile of homework the day before. Just then, a mail arrived. Harry had gotten used to this by now, but it was giving him a bit of a shock when early in the morning, when 100 owls had suddenly streamed into the great hall. During the breakfast circling the tables, they saw their own owls dropping off letters and packages on their laps. Hedwig hadn't bothered Harry with anything so far. She sometimes flew in to nibble his ear and a bit of his toast before going off to sleep with the owlery where the other school owls were. This morning, however, she fluttered down between the marmalade and the sugar bowl and dropped a note into Harry's plate. Harry tore it open at once. His very untidy scrawl. Dear Harry, I know you get Friday afternoon off. So, would you like to come and have a cup of tea with me around 3? I want to hear all about your first week. Send us an owl answer back with Hedwig. Hagrid. Harry borrowed Ron's quill, scribbled yes, please. See you later on in the back of the note. He sent Hedwig off again. It was lucky that Harry had tea with Hagrid to look forward to, because potions lessons turned out to be the worst thing that had happened to him so far. At the start of the banquet, Harry had gotten the idea that Professor Snape disliked him. By the end of the first potions lesson, he knew he'd been wrong. Snape didn't just dislike Harry, he hated him. Potions lessons took place down at one of the dungeons. It was colder here than up in the main castle, and would have been quite creepy enough without the pickled animals floating in glass jars all over the wall. Snape, like Flitwick, started the class by taking roll call. And like Flitwick, he paused at Harry Potter's name. "Ah, yes," he said softly. "Harry Potter, our new celebrity." Draco Malfoy and his friends Crabbe and Goyle sniggered behind their hands. Snape finished calling off the names, and looking up at the class, his eyes were black like Hagrid's, but they had none of the Hagrid's warmth. They were just cold and empty. It made you think of dark tunnels. "You are here to learn the subtle science of exact art of potion making," he began. He spoke barely a tone more than a whisper, but they caught every word. Like Professor McGonagall, Snape had the gift of keeping the class silent without effort. "And there's little foolish wand waving here. Many of you will be hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you'll really understand the beauty, softly simmering cauldron and the simmering fumes, the delicate powers of liquids that creep through the human veins, bewitching mind and snapping senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stop a death. If you aren't as big as a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." More silence followed the little speech. Harry and Ron exchanged looks, and their raised eyebrows. Hermione Granger was on the edge of her seat, looking desperate to start proving that she was not a dunderhead. "Potter!" said Snape suddenly. "What would I get if I added powdered root to asphodel and to an infusion of wormwood?" "Powdered root of what? Infusion of what?" Harry glanced at Ron, who looked as stumped as he was. Hermione's hands shot up in the air. "I don't know, sir," said Harry. Snape's lips curled into a sneer. "Tut, tut. Fame clearly isn't everything." He ignored Hermione's hand. "Let's try again, Potter. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" Hermione stretched her hand as high as it would go into the air without leaving her seat. But Harry didn't have the faintest idea what a bezoar was. He tried not to look at Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle, who were now shrieking with laughter. "I don't know, sir." "Oh, thought you wouldn't open a book before coming, eh, Potter?" Harry forced himself to keep looking straight into the cold eyes. He had looked through his books at the Dursleys, but Snape didn't expect him to remember everything of the 1,000 magical herbs and fungi. Snape was still ignoring Hermione's quivering hand. "What's the difference, Potter, between a monk's should and a wolf's bane?" At this, Hermione stood up, her hand stretching towards the dungeon ceiling. "I don't know," Harry said quietly. "I think Hermione does, though. Why don't you give her a try?" A few people laughed. Harry caught Seamus's eye, and Seamus winked. Snape, however, was not pleased. "Sit down!" he snapped at Hermione. "For your information, Potter, Aspersalt and Wormblood make a sleeping potion, so powerful it is known as the Draught of Living Death. A bezoar is a stone taken from the stomach of a goat, and it will save you from the most poisons. And as for monkshood and wolfsbane, they are the same plant, which also goes by the name aconite. Well, why aren't you all copying this down?" There was sudden rummaging from quills and parchment over the noise. Snape said, "And a point well taken from will be taken from Gryffindor house for your cheek, Potter." Things didn't improve for Gryffindor's potion lessons. Continued Snape put them all into pairs and set them mixing up in the simple potions and cure boils. He swept up through the long black cloak, watching them weigh dry nettles and crush snakes' fangs, criticizing almost everyone except Malfoy, who he seemed to like. He was just telling everyone to look at the perfect way Malfoy stewed his horned slugs, and the clouds of acid green smoke that was loud and hissing filled this dungeon. Neville somehow managed to melt Seamus's cauldron into a twisted blob, and the potion was seeping across the floor, burning holes into people's shoes. Within seconds, the whole class was standing on the stools, while Neville, who stood drenched in the potion, when the cauldron collapsed, moaned in pain and as angry boils sprang up all over his arms and legs. "Idiot boy!" snapped Snape. "Clearly spilled potions way with wand. I suppose you added some porcupine quills before taking the cauldron off the fire?" Neville whimpered as the boils started to pop all over his nose. "Take him up to the hospital wing," Snape spat at Seamus. They rounded on Harry and Harry and Ron, who had been working next to Neville. "You, Potter! Why didn't you tell him not to add the quills? Thought he'd make you look good if he got it wrong, did you? The another point is lost. You've lost for Gryffindor." This was so unfair that Harry opened his mouth to argue, but then Ron kicked him behind the cauldron. "Don't push it," he muttered. "I've heard Snape can run very nasty." As they climbed the steps out to the dungeon, an hour later, Harry's mind was racing with his spirits were low. He lost 2 points for Gryffindor in his very first week. Why did Snape hate him so much? "Cheer up," said Ron. "Snape's always taking points off for Fred and George. Can I come up and meet with Hagrid with you?" At 5 to 3, they left the castle and made their way across the grounds. Hagrid lived in a small wooden house on the edge of the forbidden forest. A crossbow and a pair of galoshes were outside the front door. When Harry knocked, he heard the frantic scrabbling from the side and several booming barks, and Hagrid's voice rang out saying, "Ah, back, Fang, back!" Hagrid's big, hairy face appeared at the crack and pulled the door open. "Hang on," he said. "Back, Fang!" He let them in, struggling to keep hold of the collar of an enormous black bloodhound. There was only one room inside. Hams and pheasants were hanging from the ceiling, and the copper kettle was boiling in the open fire. In the corner stood a massive bed with a patchwork quilt over it. "Make yourselves at home," Hagrid said, letting go of Fang, who bounded straight at Ron and started licking his ears. Like Hagrid, Fang was clearly not as fierce as he looked. "This is wrong," Harry told Hagrid. He was pouring a boiling water in a large teapot in the rock on the plain. "Another Weasley, eh?" said Hagrid, glancing at Ron's freckles. "I spared me life chasing your twin brothers away from the forest." The rock cakes shapeless lumps with raisins that almost broke their teeth, but Harry and Ron pretended to be enjoying them, and they told Hagrid all about the first lessons. Fang had his head on Harry's knee and drooled all over his robes. Harry and Ron were delighted when Hagrid called Filch, "Ah, that old git," and as for that cat, Mrs. Norris, I'd like to introduce her to Fang sometime. D'you know, every time I go up to your school, she follows me everywhere. Can't get rid of her. Filch puts her up to it. Harry told Hagrid about Snape's lesson. Hagrid, like Ron, told Harry not to worry about it, that Snape liked hardly any students. "But he seemed to really hate me." "Oh, rubbish," said Hagrid. "Why should he?" Yet Harry couldn't help the feeling that Hagrid didn't quite meet his eyes when he said that. "How's your brother Charlie, Hagrid?" asked Ron. "I like him lots. Great with animals." Harry wondered if Hagrid had changed the subject on purpose. While Ron had told Hagrid all about Charlie's work with the dragons, Harry picked up a piece of paper that was lying underneath the cozy. It was a cutting from the Daily Prophet. Gingrat's break-in latest. Investigators continued to the break-in at Gringotts on July 31st, widely believed to be the work of dark wizards or witches unknown. Gringotts goblins today insist that nothing has been taken. The vault that was sketched in had it, in fact, been emptied the same day. But we're not telling you what was in there, so keep your noses out of it if you know what's good for you," said the Gringotts spokeswoman that afternoon. Harry remembered Ron telling him that the train that someone had tried to rob Gringotts, and Ron hadn't mentioned the date. Hagrid, said Harry, the Gringotts break-in happened on my birthday. It might have been happening while we were there. There was no doubt about it. Hagrid definitely didn't meet Harry's eyes this time. He grunted and offered him a rock cake. Harry read the story again. That vault was in search had in fact been emptied earlier the same day. Hagrid had emptied a vault 713. If you could call that emptying, taking out the grubby little package, had been what the thieves were looking for? As Harry and Ron walked back into the castle for dinner, their pockets were weighed down with rock cakes. They had been too polite to refuse. Harry thought they were none of the lessons he'd had so far had given him much to think about, as much as the Hagrid. Had Hagrid collected the package that just in time? Where was it now? And did Hagrid know something about Snape that he didn't want to tell Harry?